born an Empyrean, a being chosen by the gods themselves. Miquella possessed a mind said to rival the greatest scholars of the Golden Order. He sought not power for its own sake, but a way to heal a broken world, to cure the scarlet rot that was slowly destroying his sister Malenia, and to build a sanctuary where the rejected and the cursed could finally live in peace. But every attempt Miquella made to protect the people he loved only drew darker forces toward him. His great Haligtree never reached the glory he dreamed of. His sister was trapped in an endless war with rot and despair. And before his plans could ever be completed, Miquella himself was stolen away, taken into the depths by a demigod who believed he could use the Empyrean to build a new dynasty in blood. Tonight, we're going to explore the full story of Miquella, one of the most powerful and mysterious figures in Elden Ring, and the tragedy of how everything he tried to save was ultimately lost. If you enjoy deep dives into the hidden stories of the lands between, consider subscribing. The origin of Miquella and his twin sister Malenia is a unique anomaly within the divine genealogy of the lands between. While other demigods were produced through the union of distinct individuals, such as Marika and Godfrey, or Radahn and Renala, the twins were born from a single, self-contained sovereign. Because Radahn and Marika were two aspects of the same being, the birth of the twins lacked the spiritual and biological diversity inherent in a two-parent union, and they were manifestations of the Golden Order's internal state, reflecting both its absolute power and its hidden structural fragilities. This singular parentage resulted in a form of divine stagnation. Miquella and Malenia were not just children of a god, they were iterations of a god's own self-reflected essence. In the eyes of scholars who study the ancient laws of the Erdtree, this lineage was proof that the Golden Order had reached its biological limit. The twins were born shackled by fundamental flaws that mirrored the rot at the heart of the world's law. They represented the peak of the golden lineage, yet they were burdened from their first breath by conditions that no amount of golden grace could ever truly mend. For the nature of their birth meant that the twins were inextricably tied to the fundamental stability of their parents' reign. Every crack in the philosophy of the Golden Order manifested as a physical or spiritual affliction within their bodies. They were the living evidence of a divine system that had become too insular, attempting to create perfection from within its own closed loop. This lack of external influence made them more susceptible to the interference of outside forces, as the protection of the Erdtree was thinned by the narrowness of their origin. Their existence served as a silent, radiating proof of the Order's internal rot, while the capital city of Leyndell celebrated them as the most blessed of the demigods. Those with a deeper understanding of the Crucible recognized the tragedy in their forms. They were beings of immense potential who were born into a state of permanent crisis. They were the final, beautiful, and broken fruit of a tree that had stopped growing and started to fold in on itself. Miquella, in particular, bore the weight of this heritage with a keen and tragic awareness. He understood that his very blood was a product of a stagnant divinity. This realization would eventually drive him to seek a path that lay entirely outside the laws of his father and mother. He saw himself and his sister as victims of a golden experiment that had failed to account for the necessity of change. Their birth was the beginning of a long and desperate attempt to outrun a destiny that was written into the very geometry of their souls. Miquella was born under a specific and profound affliction that mandated he remain a child for all eternity. This condition was far more than a simple aesthetic trait. It was a metaphysical barrier that prevented his physical form from ever catching up to the staggering maturity of his mind. While he possessed the genius of a master tactician and the revolutionary spirit of a world shaper, he was trapped within a body that lacked the height, the strength, and the presence required to exert absolute physical authority. He was the eternal infant, a being of infinite wisdom, housed in a vessel of permanent vulnerability. This curse created a jarring disconnect between his intent and his capability. Miquella could envision entire new worlds and engineer complex biological shields. But he could never stand as a towering lord on a battlefield like his father Radahn or his brother Radahn. His childhood was a cage of soft skin and small stature that mocked his divine ambitions. This physical limitation forced him to rely on indirect methods of influence, such as his power of charm and his sister's martial strength, further distancing him from the direct, warrior-based lordship of the early Golden Order. The psychological impact of being an eternal child cannot be overstated. Miquella lived through centuries of historical upheaval, while his body remained frozen in time. He watched as his siblings grew, fought, and claimed their own domains, while he remained the small, golden-haired boy in the shadow of the Erdtree. This stagnation likely fueled his obsession with growth and evolution. Everything he built, from the needles to the Haligtree itself, was an attempt to force a process of maturation that his own body was denied by the laws of the world. Furthermore, his curse was a symbol of the Golden Order's own inability to progress. He was the eternal child in a kingdom that called itself the Eternal Order. By denying him the ability to age, the Greater Will had effectively denied him the ability to move beyond the current state of reality. He was a prisoner of the status quo, a god-tier intellect that was never allowed to reach the physical threshold of godhood. This forced him into a state of constant, restless innovation, as he sought every possible loophole in the laws of nature to trigger a second birth. The tragedy of his youth was that it made him appear harmless and kind to those who did not know his true strength. Some people were drawn to the image of the innocent child prince, unaware that behind those youthful eyes was a mind capable of rewriting the laws of existence. This perception was a tool he used effectively, but it was also a source of hidden resentment. Miquella did not want to be a child to be protected. He wanted to be the architect of a new age. His struggle to break the curse was the engine that drove the world toward the events of the shattering. The relationship between Miquella and his twin sister, Malenia, was a symbiotic pact of absolute loyalty and shared suffering. They were two halves of a single, functional whole, each providing what the other lacked. Malenia, despite her own affliction of the scarlet rot, became Miquella's blade, his physical enforcer, and the sword that defended his vision. In return, Miquella served as her mind and her spiritual anchor, using his vast intelligence to find ways to suppress the rot that threatened to consume her. They were a closed circle of devotion, existing in a world that neither of them truly felt they belonged to. Miquella's entire life was defined by a desperate, frantic race to find a cure for his sister. He could not bear to see her physical form succumb to the influence of the god of rot, viewing her decay as the ultimate failure of the world they lived in. Every project he undertook was motivated by the hope that he could finally grant her a life free from the cycle of blooming and rot. His love for her was the purest and most driving force in his character, a sincerity that stood in stark contrast to the manipulative nature of his later divine ambitions. For Malenia, Miquella was the only thing in the universe worth her protection. She abandoned her own potential for lordship to serve his cause, believing that his unalloyed vision was the only future that held any promise. She allowed herself to be his weapon, standing as the terrifying guardian of his secrets. Her strength was the wall that allowed Miquella the peace to conduct his research. Without her, Miquella was a defenseless child. Without Miquella, Malenia was a mindless force of destruction, waiting to be unleashed by the rot. This bond was also a source of immense pressure. Because Miquella was the only one who could hold back the rot, Malenia's survival was entirely dependent on his success. But this created a dynamic where Miquella felt he could never fail, leading him to take increasingly drastic measures as his initial attempts were thwarted. The weight of his sister's life was the burden that pushed him to abandon the Golden Order, and eventually even his own humanity. He was a brother who loved too much, and that love became the catalyst for a series of catastrophic failures. Ultimately, their relationship was the most stable and honest thing in a world of betrayal. While the other demigods plotted against one another, the twins remained a unified front. But this closeness also made them blind to the ways they were enabling each other's descent into tragedy. Malenia's absolute obedience allowed Miquella to pursue his goals without question, even when those goals began to cost him his soul. They were two divine children clinging to each other in a storm, never realizing that the bond that saved them was also the rope that would eventually pull them both into the dark. In the early years of his intellectual development, Miquella was a devout and brilliant scholar of Golden Order fundamentalism. He followed in the footsteps of his father, Radahn, seeking to understand the world through the lens of rigid divine law and mathematical precision. During this period, he worked closely with the Second Elden Lord to create complex incantations that reflected the beauty and the logic of the Erdtree. One such invention was the triple rings of light, sheer testament to his mastery over the golden light and his belief that the Order could solve any problem through the application of its own internal principles. Fundamentalism was, for Miquella, a quest for the ultimate truth. He believed that the scarlet rot was simply a biological error within the system, a jagged piece of reality that could be smoothed over with the right divine equation. He poured his genius into the study of regression and causality, the two pillars of his father's philosophy, hoping to find a way to return his sister's body to a state of uncorrupted purity. He was the golden boy of the capital, the intellectual heir to a kingdom that believed its logic was absolute and its grace was all-encompassing. This phase of his life was marked by a sincere attempt to work within the established system. He did not start as a revolutionary. He started as a son trying to honor his father's legacy by using the tools he was given. He believed that the light of the Erdtree was the answer to every shadow. His early incantations were gifts of love, intended to provide Malenia with the spiritual fortification she needed to resist the god of decay. He was a scientist of the soul, operating under the assumption that the greater will was a benevolent force that desired the healing of its subjects. Miquella's contributions to fundamentalism were so profound that they were recorded in the holy texts of the age. He was recognized as a prodigy who could see the connections between the stars and the gold that even older scholars missed. He brought a sense of youthful energy to the rigid church of Lendl, suggesting that the Golden Order was still a living, evolving thing. But this hope was predicated on the belief that the Order was capable of addressing the influence of outer gods, a belief that would soon be shattered by the reality of his sister's condition. The failure of fundamentalism to provide a cure was Miquella's first true heartbreak. No matter how many rings of light he cast, or how many divine laws he invoked, the rot continued its slow, inexorable march through Malenia's flesh. He realized that the Golden Order was designed to sustain itself, not to heal the outside influence of an outer god. This intellectual disillusionment was the first crack in his loyalty. He began to see the fundamentalist path not as a source of truth, but as a set of golden shackles that prevented him from seeing the world as it truly was. The moment Miquella realized that Golden Order fundamentalism was powerless to cure the Scarlet Rot was the most significant turning point in his life. He had reached the limits of his father's logic and found it wanting. The Scarlet Rot was not a mere sickness. It was the influence of a rival outer god, a force of decay that existed outside the jurisdiction of the Erdtree. Miquella understood that the Golden Order was an exclusionary system. It functioned by cutting away what it could not control, rather than healing what was broken. This realization was a devastating blow to his faith and his sense of purpose. His disillusionment was rooted in a practical observation. The grace of the Erdtree was a closed loop. It was designed to preserve Marika's age, but it offered no defense against the invasive philosophies of the stars or the rot. Miquella saw that his father's fundamentalism was a defensive shell that had become a prison. He realized that to save Malenia, he had to look beyond the gold. This was the moment he abandoned the Church of Leyndell and the path of the Scholar Prince, choosing instead to become a heretic in the pursuit of a higher, more effective truth. This failure changed Miquella from a student into a creator. He stopped trying to interpret the existing laws and started trying to invent new ones. He began to experiment with the idea of unalloyed gold, a substance that would be free from the meddling of any god, including the greater will. His rejection of his father was not an act of rebellion for its own sake, but an act of desperation. He was a brother who had been told no by the highest power in the world, and he refused to accept that answer as final. The emotional fallout of this failure created a distance between Miquella and the rest of the royal family. While Radahn remained obsessed with the perfection of the ring, Miquella was looking at the rot. He began to see the Golden Order as a stagnant, failing order that was content to let his sister die as long as the status quo was maintained. This resentment was the seed that would eventually bloom into his plan to build a rival Erdtree. He had learned that the gold of his parents was alloyed with the desires of the cosmos, and he wanted something purer. The first failure proved that Miquella was more powerful than the system he was born into. His mind was too large to be contained by a single divine philosophy. By walking away from fundamentalism, he was the first to acknowledge that the Golden Age was over and that a new solution was required. He set out into the world as a lone innovator, carrying the burden of his sister's life and the weight of a world that had failed him. He was no longer a boy who should have been a god. He was a boy who decided to make himself one. In his quest for a world free from the influence of parasitic cosmic entities, Miquella invented the material known as unalloyed gold. This was not merely a precious metal. It was a technological and spiritual breakthrough designed to ward off the meddling of outer gods. Miquella had correctly identified that the suffering of the lands between was caused by the competing agendas of celestial beings, from the greater will to the god of rot. Unalloyed gold was his declaration of independence, a biological and metaphysical shield intended to protect the human soul from being used as a vessel for alien wills. The creation of this material was a massive departure from the traditional alchemy of the Erdtree, while the gold of the Golden Order was a conduit for the greater will's grace. Miquella's gold was a neutralizer. It acted as a silence in a world filled with the screaming demands of the gods. He sought to create a purity that was defined by the absence of celestial interference. This was Miquella's version of a secular divinity, a path where humanity could finally be left alone to govern its own destiny without being nuked by rot or shackled by grace. Miquella's unalloyed gold was a manifestation of his compassion. He saw the trauma that the cosmic wars had inflicted on the people and sought to build a wall that the gods could not pass. It was a biological shield for the spirit, a way to ensure that the individual remained the master of their own flesh. This invention was the cornerstone of his new order, a promise of a world where curses and rot would have no place. He was the only demigod who saw the outer gods as the true problem, and he was the only one with the genius to build a weapon against them. However, the production of unalloyed gold was a delicate and difficult process. It required a level of purity and focus that few could maintain. Miquella poured his own blood and his own essence into the refinement of the metal, making it a physical extension of his will. The material was his masterpiece, the one thing that actually worked where his father's magic had failed. It provided Malenia with the only relief she had ever known, suppressing the rot and allowing her to maintain her sanity, even as her body continued to decay. The invention of unalloyed gold also marked the beginning of Miquella's role as a kind savior. He shared his discovery with those who were suffering, offering them a chance to escape the influence of the gods. But this kindness had a hidden edge. By providing the shield, Miquella was also making himself the only source of protection. The transition from the boy who found a cure to the god who compels love began here with the creation of a material that made him the ultimate arbiter of who was pure and who was corrupted. The most sophisticated application of Miquella's research into unalloyed gold was the creation of his golden needle. This was not a weapon of war, but a surgical tool for the soul. It was designed to be inserted directly into the body to sever the link between a host and an outer god, acting as a spiritual lightning rod that diverted the cosmic influence. Miquella made it specifically to freeze Malenia's scarlet rot in its tracks, providing a permanent solution where his incantations had only provided temporary relief. The needle was the ultimate expression of his desire to fix the broken world through precision and intellect. The needle was a masterpiece of unalloyed technology, capable of suppressing even the most virulent of cosmic curses. It represented Miquella's belief that divinity was something that could be managed and manipulated through careful engineering. He did not seek to pray the rot away. He sought to cut it out. This was Miquella at his most heroic, a brother wielding a tiny golden needle against the primordial power of a god of decay. For a time, it worked, allowing Malenia to become the blade of Miquella and fight in his name without losing herself to the bloom. However, the needle was also a fragile and incomplete solution. For it to reach its full potential and truly purge an outer god's influence, it required a power that the lands between no longer possessed. It needed to be activated in a place that existed outside of time, such as the heart of the storm in Farum Azula. Miquella's genius had created the tool, but the world was too broken to provide the energy needed to use it effectively. This frustration was another step in his descent, as he realized that even his greatest inventions were limited by the stagnant reality of the Erdtree. The needle also represents Miquella's willingness to perform invasive procedures on the people he loved. To save Malenia, he had to pierce her flesh with his gold. This was a literal and figurative shackling, as her survival became dependent on the presence of his needle. It was a benevolent form of control, but control nonetheless. The needle was the precursor to his power of charm. It was a physical way to ensure that a soul stayed aligned with his vision. He was fixing the world by pinning it in place with golden needles. The needle remains one of the most tragic items in the game. It is a symbol of a cure that was almost within reach. It represents the kindness of Miquella in its purest form, a desperate attempt to save his sister from a horrific fate. But its failure to provide a final solution drove Miquella toward the divine nuclear option of the Shadow Realm. He had learned that a needle could stop a rot, but it could not build a new world. For that, he would need something much larger than a sliver of gold. He would need a tree of his own. Realizing that the Erdtree would never accommodate his unalloyed vision, Miquella decided to grow his own rival World Tree. He took a sapling and planted it in the frozen north, at the base of a massive mountain. To foster its growth in such a hostile environment, Miquella performed an act of supreme biological sacrifice. He watered the sapling with his own divine blood. He sought to create a tree that was not fueled by the greater will's grace, but by his own inherent vitality. This was the birth of the Haligtree, a monument to his independence and a cradle for his new order. The Haligtree was intended to be an alternative to the Erdtree, a sanctuary that did not require the approval of the fingers or the sacrifice of the impure. Miquella envisioned it as a place of absolute purity, where the curses of the world could be washed away by his own holy essence. It was a cradle of the meek, a massive, sprawling structure that welcomed the discarded and the broken, while the Erdtree was a monument of gold and law. The Haligtree was a monument of flesh and compassion. It was Miquella's attempt to be a better god than his mother. The growth of the tree was a reflection of Miquella's own state. It was beautiful, intricate, and vast, but it was also inherently fragile. Because it was fed by Miquella's blood, its health was tied directly to his own. It was a tree built on a foundation of self-mutilation, a biological gamble that required Miquella to give up his own strength to provide a home for others. This was the pinnacle of his kindness, a demigod literally draining himself to build a paradise for those who had nowhere else to go. The architecture of the Haligtree was a masterpiece of organic integration. Entire cities were built into its branches, and the people who lived there were protected by the sheer scale of the tree's canopy. It was a world within a world, a secret empire that defied the maps of the Golden Order. For a brief period, it seemed that Miquella had succeeded where everyone else had failed. He had built a world without rot and without the fingers. But the tree remained stunted, never quite reaching the celestial heights of the Erdtree, a silent reminder that Miquella's childhood curse still affected everything he touched. Ultimately, the Haligtree remains as a beautiful, rotting tragedy. It is the graveyard of Miquella's first dream. Without his presence to maintain the flow of blood, the tree became susceptible to the very rot he had tried to escape. It is a lesson in the dangers of building an order on the vitality of a single individual. The Haligtree was a cradle that became a tomb, a testament to the fact that Miquella's compassion was not enough to overcome the fundamental stagnation of the world. He had built a tree, but he had failed to build a future. The Haligtree stands as a monumental testament to Miquella's rejection of the Golden Order's exclusionary dogma. While the Erdtree and the capital city of Leyndell were built upon the systematic purging of the impure, Miquella's tree was designed to be a sanctuary for the discarded. He opened his arms to the Albinaurics, a race of artificial beings who were viewed as soulless accidents of alchemy and hunted for their lack of grace. To these people, Miquella was not just a prince. He was the only divine figure in the lands between who acknowledged their right to exist. This sanctuary extended to the misbegotten and the leonine misbegotten, creatures whose features bore the marks of the primordial crucible and were thus considered cursed by the fundamentalists of the gold. Miquella looked upon these monsters and saw only the vibrant, original life of the world. He promised them a place where their biology was not a sin, and where their strength would be valued rather than feared. The branches of the Haligtree became a mosaic of the world's outcasts, a civilization built by those who had been told they had no place in Marika's age. The presence of the Albinaurics at the Haligtree highlights Miquella's commitment to providing a tangible, physical home for the disenfranchised. He guided them through the consecrated snowfields, offering them a light to follow when the sun of the Erdtree had turned its back on them. The town of Elfale, nestled within the roots of the tree, became a bustling refuge where the meek could live with a dignity that was denied to them elsewhere. Miquella was building an army of the grateful, a society where loyalty was born from the relief of being seen. However, this refuge was also a place of profound stagnation. Because the Haligtree was outside the cycle of the Erdtree, the people who lived there were in a state of suspended animation, waiting for Miquella's own transformation to be completed. They were a people in waiting, their entire existence tethered to the health of the boy prince who had saved them. The Haligtree was a cradle, but for many it was also a dead end. They had escaped the fire of the capital only to find themselves in a cold, frozen north, dependent on a god who was increasingly preoccupied with his own biological evolution. The gathering of the unwanted was the ultimate expression of Miquella's kindness. He had done what his parents refused to do. He had created a world for everyone. But by gathering all the world's vulnerability into a single fragile location, he had also created a massive target. The Haligtree was a beautiful dream of inclusivity, but it was anchored in the blood of an Empyrean who was running out of time. The people nobody wanted had finally found a home, but they were about to discover that a home built on the shoulders of a child is one that can be easily shattered. Part 10. The Charm. The most terrifying aspect of Miquella's divinity was his innate power to compel affection and force others to love him. This was not a subtle charisma or a political talent, but a supernatural aura of charm that acted as a spiritual lobotomy on those who came into his presence. Every act of kindness Miquella performed was backed by an irresistible compulsion that smoothed over dissent and turned even his enemies into his most loyal servants. It is the terrible power that defines his legacy, raising the haunting question of whether his followers were truly inspired by his vision or merely enslaved by his magic. This power made Miquella the most dangerous of all the Empyreans, because it attacked the will of his subjects directly. While Malenia used a sword and Radahn used gravity, Miquella used the heart. He could end a conflict simply by being seen, turning a battlefield into a circle of adoration. This ability allowed him to build the Haligtree and gather his followers with a speed and unity that no other demigod could match. But it also meant that the love he received was artificial, a reflection of his own magical influence rather than a genuine human connection. In the land of shadow, the true nature of this charm is revealed with devastating clarity. When Miquella's great rune is eventually broken, the magical fog lifts from his followers, and they are left to confront the reality of their own manipulated emotions. The friendship and unity they felt vanished in an instant, replaced by the realization that their loyalty had been a magically enforced illusion. Miquella did not lead through inspiration. He led through a divine form of mind control that made it impossible for anyone to be unkind to him. This power recontextualizes every act of compassion in Miquella's life. Was the sanctuary of the Haligtree a genuine refuge, or was it a massive cult where the unwanted were simply more susceptible to his charm? By providing the Albinorics and the misbegotten with a home, he earned a loyalty that was already being magically enforced. He was a savior who removed the free will of those he saved, ensuring that his age of compassion would be a world where conflict was impossible because disagreement had been biologically erased. Miquella's charm is the ultimate expression of his childhood curse. He was a boy who needed to be loved, and he became a god who ensured that he always was. But a world where love is a command is a world without soul. Miquella's kindness was a velvet glove over a divine iron fist, a power that turned the lands between into a playground for his own emotional needs. He wanted to fix the world by making it love him, never realizing that a heart that is forced to beat for another is a heart that has already stopped living for itself. Part 11. The Cocoon. To break the curse of his eternal youth and finally mature into the godhood his soul required, Miquella embedded himself in the roots of the Haligtree. He created a massive organic cocoon, intending to undergo a process of metamorphosis where he would molt his child flesh and emerge as a full-grown god of purity. This was the ultimate stage of his biological gamble. He was merging his essence with the tree he had watered with his blood, attempting to restart the cycle of the world through his own physical transformation. In this state, he was at his most vulnerable, a silent and dreaming chrysalis at the center of his secret empire. The cocoon was intended to be the crucible of a new age. Within its silk-like layers, Miquella was rearranging his very divinity, shedding the alloyed aspects of his Golden Order heritage. He was attempting to become a self-contained source of grace, a tree and a god that were one and the same. While he dreamed, his followers in the Haligtree guarded him with a religious fervor, believing that his awakening would signal the end of their suffering and the beginning of a world without rot. The cocoon was the physical embodiment of the world's hope for a kinder future. However, the process required an immense amount of time and a staggering amount of vital energy. As Miquella slept, the Haligtree began to struggle, its growth slowing as it waited for its master to emerge. The tree was a body without a head, and the cocoon was a heart that had not yet started to beat. Miquella's soul was wandering in the dream realms, perhaps even manifesting as his other half, Saint Trina, while his body remained a motionless prize in the dark. It was during this period of absolute vulnerability that his plan was derailed by a force he had not accounted for. The kidnapping of the cocoon by Mohg, the Lord of Blood, was a catastrophe that destroyed the Haligtree's potential. Mohg tore the chrysalis from the roots, physically ripping Miquella away from the source of his growth. This act of violence did more than just relocate the Empyrean. It shattered the biological link that was sustaining the tree. The cocoon was taken to the subterranean blood swamps, where it was subjected to horrific rituals that were never intended for Miquella's unalloyed flesh. The molting process was interrupted, leaving Miquella's body a withered, giant-sized limb protruding from a broken shell. Ultimately, the cocoon is the symbol of Miquella's unfinished work. It represents a god who was almost born, a future that was snatched away in its final moments. When the Tarnished finds the cocoon in the Mohgwyn Palace, they are seeing the wreckage of the Haligtree's dream. The body inside is no longer a child, but it is not a god either. It is a distorted, reaching arm that points toward a sky it will never touch. Miquella's attempt to molt his curse had resulted in a deeper tragedy, leaving his physical form a discarded husk, while his soul was forced to find a new, even more desperate path to the divine. Part 12. Mohg's Obsession. The kidnapping of Miquella is often framed as the crime of a depraved and obsessed monster, but the truth revealed in the Land of Shadow is far more disturbing. Mohg, the Lord of Blood, did not stumble upon the Haligtree by accident. He was likely lured and charmed by Miquella himself. Miquella needed a way to shed his physical body and reach the realm of shadow, a task that required a specific kind of bloody, sacrificial gateway. He used his power of charm to engineer his own kidnapping, turning Mohg's obsession into a tool for his own divine agenda. The Lord of Blood was not the master of the situation. He was a vessel being steered by a dreaming child. Mohg's obsession was fueled by Miquella's irresistible aura, leading him to believe that he could raise the Empyrean as a god of the formless mother. He shared his bed and his blood with the cocoon, attempting to nurture a new dynasty built on the power of the blood flame. But Miquella was never truly there. He was using Mohg as a biological battery, a source of raw, primal energy that could fuel his soul's journey across the veil. Mohg's love was a magical leash that kept him performing the very rituals Miquella needed to complete his transition. This revelation recontextualizes the entire Mohgwyn Palace as a secondary, accidental sanctuary for Miquella's goals. While the world saw a horrific blood cult, Miquella saw a functional exit strategy. He allowed his body to be desecrated and his cocoon to be stolen because the Haligtree had failed to grant him the godhood he sought. Mohg was the vessel in more ways than one. His body and his blood provided the bridge that Miquella used to walk out of the lands between and into the history of the shadow. The tragedy of Mohg is that he died believing he was the architect of a new age. He was a man who had spent his life rejected as an omen, only to be chosen by the most beautiful of the demigods. He never realized that his devotion was a magical command. When the Tarnished kills Mohg, they are not just stopping a bloodlord, they are finishing the job Miquella started. Miquella required Mohg to die so that his body could be used to host the soul of a new consort. The Lord of Blood was a pawn who was sacrificed the moment his usefulness ended. The kidnapping proves that Miquella's kindness was a force of absolute cold calculation. He was willing to sacrifice his brother's mind and body to achieve his vision for the world. He turned a horrific crime into a planned detour, showing that he was the most fearsome of the Empyreans not because of his strength, but because of his ability to make his enemies do his work for him. Mohg's obsession was just another thread in Miquella's golden web, a dark and bloody chapter in the story of a boy who was willing to use anything and anyone to become a god. Part 13. The Blood Offerings. In the lightless depths of the Mohgwyn Palace, the cocoon of Miquella was subjected to centuries of blood offerings that were intended to birth a new divinity. Mohg, acting as the self-appointed consort to a dreaming god, saturated the chrysalis with the blood of the formless mother and the life force of countless sacrifices. He sought to mature Miquella into a god of the blood flame, believing that the raw vitality of the omen curse could succeed where the gold of the Erdtree had failed. The cocoon became a grotesque, pulsing heart at the center of a subterranean nightmare, fed by the constant violence of the Lord of Blood's followers. However, these offerings were ultimately futile because the soul of Miquella was already absent. While Mohg was pouring his essence into the physical shell, Miquella's consciousness had already departed for the land of shadow. The cocoon did not bloom into a god of blood. It became a withered, reaching husk. The giant grey arm that protrudes from the silk is the evidence of this failure. It is a biological runaway, a limb grown through the unnatural influence of the formless mother. But it lacks the divine spark of Miquella's soul. Mohg was essentially watering a dead plant with the blood of an empire. Miquella utilized these offerings as a battery for his spiritual journey. The raw power generated by Mohg's devotion was the fuel that allowed Miquella to cross the veil into the shadow realm. He was a parasite of the Bloodlord's ambition, drinking the energy of the formless mother without ever intending to serve her. This was the ultimate irony of the Mohgwyn dynasty. It was built on a lie. The rituals were not creating a god. They were powering an escape. Miquella was a golden ghost presiding over a throne of blood, using the horror of the omen to facilitate his own ascension. The failure of the blood offerings also highlights the incompatibility of Miquella's unalloyed nature with the primal forces of the outer gods. Even in his dreaming state, Miquella's essence resisted the influence of the formless mother. He could use her power, but he would never be her vessel. The cocoon remained a stagnant anomaly, a monument to Mohg's delusion and Miquella's cold-hearted efficiency. The blood was just a medium, a dark river that carried Miquella away from the physical world and into the realm of the veil. The blood offerings were a waste of an entire lineage's vitality. Mohg had sacrificed everything to nourish a vacancy. The sight of the cocoon, cracked and bleeding, is the final proof that Miquella's plans always involved the destruction of those who followed him. He took the blood and left the husk. As the tarnished approaches the throne, they find a god who has already left and a consort who is still frantically pouring life into a dream that has already turned to ash. The offerings were the last, desperate gasps of a dynasty that was dead before it ever truly began. Part 14. What Miquella left behind. When Miquella was taken from the Haligtree, the world he had built for the meek began to die in a state of absolute agonizing slow motion. The tree, which was fed by his divine blood, lost its primary source of nourishment and began to wither. Without Miquella's presence to suppress the influences of the outer gods, the scarlet rot that infested Malenia began to seep into the very wood of the sanctuary. The Haligtree transitioned from a cradle of hope into a rot-infested husk, a place where the outcasts who had followed Miquella were left to rot alongside the branches that had once protected them. The abandonment of the Albinaurics and the misbegotten is perhaps the greatest stain on Miquella's legacy. He had promised them a haven and a new age, but he left them in a freezing, decaying graveyard while he pursued his own godhood in the land of shadow. Those who survived the rot were left in a state of catatonic mourning, their entire civilization frozen in the moment of their savior's departure. They continue to guard the Haligtree, not because it has a future, but because it is the only thing they have left. Miquella's kindness had brought them to the north, but his ambition had left them there to die. Malenia's return to the Haligtree after her catastrophic battle with Radahn was a moment of absolute despair. She crawled back to the roots of the tree, broken and rot-eaten, only to find an empty chair and a withered cocoon. The brother she had fought for, the one person she believed could save her, was gone. This discovery broke what remained of her spirit, leading her to wait at the base of the tree in a catatonic state, dreaming of a brother who had already moved on. She became a silent guardian of a vacancy, a blade without a mind to guide it. The the city of Elphael became a place of beautiful, silent decay. The intricate architecture was overgrown with fungal blooms, and the knights who once served Miquella were forced to use self-destructive fire to keep the rot at bay. The Haligtree became a warning to the rest of the world. An order built on the vitality of a single being is one that will collapse the moment that being leaves. Miquella had sought to create a better Erdtree, but he had accidentally created a more concentrated version of the world's stagnation. He had left behind a tragedy that he no longer had the heart to fix. Ultimately, what Miquella left behind was the wreckage of his own compassion. He had started 100 projects, the needle, the tree, the city, and he had abandoned them all the moment a more divine option presented itself. He was a god of new beginnings who could never handle the reality of an ending. The Haligtree remains a testament to his failure, a rotting monument to a boy who wanted to save everyone but ended up saving no one. As the Tarnished explores the dying branches, they are walking through the debris of a heart that decided that the world wasn't worth the wait. Part 15, Saint Trina. Saint Trina is the discarded other half of Miquella, a being of sleep and dreams who represents everything the Empyrean had to shed to become a god. In the Land of Shadow, we learn that Saint Trina was not just a separate identity or a disguise, but a physical manifestation of Miquella's love, his doubts, and his capacity for rest. To ascend the gate of divinity and become a being of pure compassion, Miquella believed he had to cast away the vulnerable parts of his soul. He abandoned Saint Trina in the Garden of Deep Purple, physically purging her from his being and leaving her to wilt in the darkness of a deep floral pit. The existence of Saint Trina redefines Miquella's journey as an act of spiritual self-mutilation. Saint Trina was the part of Miquella that could offer a true peace, the peace of sleep and the quiet of the dream realm. She was the one who could empathize with the suffering of the world without needing to control it. By discarding her, Miquella was essentially lobotomizing himself. He removed his ability to vacillate or to feel the weight of his own actions, turning himself into a cold, cosmic machine of kindness that lacked the humanity of love. Saint Trina is the ghost of Miquella's original intent, the voice of a heart that he chose to silence. When the Tarnished finds Saint Trina in the depths of the stone coffin hole, she is a tragic figure, a beautiful and wilting entity that begs for death. She understands the horror of Miquella's goal in a way that no one else can. Through her nectar, she whispers a final, desperate warning. Godhood would be Miquella's prison. She knows that a god without love is not a savior, but a stagnant entity that can only perpetuate its own existence. She pleads with the Tarnished to kill Miquella, not out of hate, but to save him from the eternal, lonely burden of a divinity that lacks a soul. The relationship between Miquella and Saint Trina is the final proof of the cost of his ascension. He did not just sacrifice Mohg or the Haligtree, he sacrificed himself. He cut away the part of him that was capable of dreaming, and the part of him that was capable of loving his sister. What remained was a radiant, beautiful deity that offered a hug to the world. But it was a hug from a being that had forgotten what warmth feels like. Saint Trina is the evidence that Miquella's age of compassion was born from a state of absolute, hollowed-out coldness. Saint Trina is the most successful and most tragic of Miquella's failures. She is the only part of him that actually understood the value of an ending. While Miquella sought to fix the world by making it eternal, Saint Trina offered the world the mercy of a deep, final sleep. She is the priestess of the true Miquella, the one who loved Malenia and cared for the Albinaurics. By leaving her in the dark, Miquella ensured his godhood, but he also ensured that he would never truly wake up. He became a god of the morning by murdering the saint of the night. Part 16. The Realm of Shadow. The Realm of Shadow served as the final stage for Miquella's divine theatre, a hidden world where he could physically and spiritually reconstruct himself. He used the body of the Lord of Blood as a literal gateway, a bloody bridge that allowed his soul to cross the veil while leaving the wreckage of the lands between behind. This was not a journey of exploration, but a mission of absolute erasure. Miquella viewed the Land of Shadow as a place where the order of his mother had begun and where it could finally be replaced. He used the death of Mohg at the hands of the Tarnished as the final key to unlock the path to the gate of divinity. Within this realm, Miquella was able to bypass the influence of the Greater Will and the Two Fingers. The Shadow Realm is a place where the rules of the Erdtree do not fully apply, allowing an Empyrean to perform the dark alchemy of ascension without interference. Miquella spent his time here shedding the last remnants of his lineage, marking his progress with golden crosses that signify the pieces of himself he left in the dirt. He was stripping himself down to a singular divine point, preparing his soul to inhabit the body of a new consort and usher in an age that would finally fix the world. The Land of Shadow provided Miquella with the raw material he needed for his new lordship. He sought the Gate of Divinity at Anir Ilim, the same structure where Marika had originally ascended. He believed that by retracing her steps, but with kindly intent, he could succeed where she had failed. He used the memory of his brother, Radahn, and the physical vessel of Mohg to create a new hybrid divinity, a lord and a god who were bound together by his charm. The Shadow Realm was the laboratory where he performed his final, horrific experiment on the nature of reality. This realm also allowed Miquella to act without the scrutiny of those who had followed him in the Haligtree. Here, in the dark, he could discard Saint Trina and break his great rune without consequence. He was a god in the making, a being who was willing to burn his own past and the history of his family to ensure a perfect future. The Land of Shadow was the only place where Miquella could be truly honest about his ruthlessness, as there were no Albinaurics left to see the cost of his kindness. It was the land of his final triumph and his final soul-crushing loss. The Realm of Shadow is the place where Miquella's tragedy reached its logical conclusion. He had used everyone, Mohg, Malenia, and the Tarnished, to reach this hidden world, only to realize that the godhood he sought was a prison of his own making. The Shadow Realm was the mirror that reflected his true self, a boy who had cut away everything that made him human to become a deity of pure, mindless compassion. He had reached the gate, but he had left his soul at the crosses, becoming a radiant ghost in a land of ash and silence. Part 17. Godwyn's Death and the Third Failure. Miquella's history is a sequence of increasingly desperate attempts to rectify the tragedies of the Golden Lineage, none more poignant than his struggle to grant his half-brother, Godwyn the Golden, a true death. After the Night of the Black Knives, Godwyn's soul was annihilated, but his body remained as a soulless, spreading cancer at the roots of the Erdtree. Miquella viewed this state of living in death as the ultimate cruelty, a stagnation that the Golden Order could not fix. He led a massive ritual at Castle Saul, attempting to trigger an eclipse that would drain the power of the stars and finally allow Godwyn to pass away with dignity. The ritual at Castle Saul ended in total failure, as the sun was not swallowed and the eclipse never came. Miquella's prayers and the sacrifices of his loyal ghosts were not enough to overcome the celestial stagnation of the age. This was the third and final heartbreak of his early career. He had failed to cure his sister, he had failed to grow his tree, and now he had failed to save his brother from a monstrous immortality. The realization that he could not achieve a true death, for Godwyn, through traditional divinity, was the final straw that broke Miquella's faith in the world as it was. This failure was the catalyst for his divine nuclear option. If the laws of the lands between were so broken that they denied even the mercy of a grave, Miquella decided that the laws themselves had to be discarded. He stopped trying to work within the reality of the Erdtree and began looking toward the land of shadow, a realm where all manners of death wash up. He concluded that only by becoming a god himself could he rewrite the rules of existence. His grief for Godwyn turned into a cold, academic determination to ascend the gate of divinity, no matter the cost to his own soul. The failure at Castle Sol also highlighted Miquella's growing isolation. He was a demigod who could envision perfect solutions but lacked the cosmic power to execute them. He began to see his own empathy as a weakness that caused him pain, leading him toward the path of shedding his humanity. The Golden Prince died at Castle Sol, replaced by a desperate Empyrean who was ready to sacrifice everything, his heart, his flesh, and his love, to ensure he never had to feel the weight of failure again. Ultimately, Godwyn remained a fish-like monster in the deep, a silent witness to the moment Miquella gave up on being a brother. The eclipse that did not happen was the final sign that the stars and the gold were no longer listening. Miquella turned his back on the sun, choosing to seek a new power in the dark of the Shadow Realm, carrying the weight of 3 massive failures as his only baggage. Part 18, Shedding Everything. To become a god, Miquella undertook a pilgrimage of absolute self-erasure throughout the land of shadow. He identified that the flaws of the previous gods, including his mother Marika, were rooted in their human attachments and their lingering traumas. To avoid repeating their mistakes, Miquella decided to physically and spiritually divest himself of everything that defined him as a person. At each of the golden crosses he left across the Shadow Realm, he discarded a piece of his being, his right arm, his left eye, his heart, and eventually his very ability to feel doubt or fear. This process was an act of extreme spiritual violence. By the time Miquella reached the final cross at the entrance to the Shadowkeep, he had abandoned his love in the form of Saint Trina and his fate as an Empyrean of the Two Fingers. He was no longer the child prince who had watered the Haligtree with his blood. He was a radiant, hollowed-out entity that existed only as a vehicle for his new order. This shedding was intended to make him a kind god, but in reality it made him a cold one. He had removed the very parts of himself, his hesitation and his grief, that had originally made him want to save the world. The crosses serve as the physical evidence of Miquella's descent into a state of divine automation. He was trading his humanity for the power to compel others, believing that a god must be a being of absolute, unblinking certainty. But by casting away his heart and his love, he lost the capacity to understand the people he sought to rule. He became a god of the idea of compassion, a being who could offer a hug to the world but could no longer feel the warmth of the person he was holding. The crosses are the graves of Miquella's self, marking the road where a boy died so that a monster of light could be born. The tragedy of this shedding is that Miquella was doing it out of a sincere belief that it was necessary for the world's survival. He saw the self as the source of all conflict and sought to become the first deity who was entirely selfless. But a being without a self is a being without a moral compass. By the time he reached the gate of divinity, Miquella was a vacuum of intent, a god whose kindness was as indifferent as the stars. He had successfully broken his shackles, but he had also broken the mirror that allowed him to see his own reflection. Each discarded piece left at the crosses began to wither and rot, creating small pockets of stagnant divinity throughout the shadow realm. The ghosts of the land began to gather around these relics, drawn to the lingering scent of Miquella's discarded grace. He was unmaking himself in order to remake the universe, a process that left him as a ghost of his former identity. By the time he stood before the gate of corpses, he was less a person and more a force of nature, stripped of the very empathy that had initially driven him to seek a better world. Part 19. Miquella's Followers. In the land of shadow, Miquella was followed by a group of warriors and scholars who believed they were united by a shared devotion to his age of compassion. Characters like Leda, Freya, and more followed him into the dark, finding in Miquella a purpose that the shattered surface world could no longer provide. However, this unity was entirely artificial. Miquella had used his power of charm to bind them together, magically suppressing their personal vendettas and their conflicting histories to create a temporary, blissful alliance. The horrific nature of this bond was revealed when Miquella eventually broke his great rune to finalize his ascension. The moment the rune shattered, the great charm vanished, and the fog lifted from the minds of his followers. The group immediately collapsed into a state of murderous infighting and existential crisis. Leda, the most devoted of the group, turned into a paranoid executioner, hunting down anyone she suspected of disloyalty. Freya was left to grapple with her loyalty to Radahn, and Mohg was consumed by a despair that Miquella's charm had previously held at bay. This collapse proved that Miquella's vision for the world was a house of cards. His age of compassion was not a world of peace, but a world of suppressed violence. He had not solved the problems of the human heart, and he had simply painted over them with a golden light. The followers were the experimental subjects for his godhood, and their failure showed that Miquella's method of ruling was fundamentally deceptive. He provided a high that allowed people to ignore their trauma, but he offered no true healing. The followers also represent the tragedy of the meek who believed in him. They had given up their lives and their identities to follow a child who promised them a better world, only to realize they were just pawns in a divine chess match. Miquella's abandonment of his followers after the charm broke showed his absolute lack of concern for the individuals who served him. Once they had helped him reach the gate, their emotional stability was no longer his concern. Leda's final descent into bloodlust is the most damning evidence against Miquella's kindness. Her devotion was so total that even after the charm broke, she remained trapped in the logic of the cull. She became a monster to protect a god who had already discarded her, proving that Miquella's influence leaves a permanent scar on the mind. The followers were left to slaughter each other in the shadow of the tower, a final bloody testament to a god who claimed to hate conflict. Part 20. Radahn as promised consort. The most shocking revelation of Miquella's plan was his choice of Star-Scourge Radahn as his promised consort. Miquella had been obsessed with Radahn since their youth, seeing in the massive general a combination of kindness and strength that made him the ideal lord for a new age. Just this choice was the true reason for Malenia's campaign in Caelid. The Battle of Aeonia was not a war for territory, but a ritualized attempt to kill Radahn's body so that his soul could be claimed and brought to the land of shadow. Radahn's role in Miquella's age was to be the lion that enforced the kindness. Miquella understood that his own power was purely spiritual and psychological. He needed a lord with the physical might to hold the world in place while he charmed it. The resurrection of Radahn in the body of Mohg was the final, horrific synthesis of Miquella's work. He had combined the soul of his most admired brother with the body of his most manipulated one. This was the perfect lord, a being of absolute strength who was bound by Miquella's charm. The promise that Miquella refers to is one of the most ambiguous elements of his story. It is unclear if Radahn ever truly agreed to this arrangement, or if the promise was another product of Miquella's irresistible compulsion. Regardless of the general's original intent, the Radahn who emerges at the gate of divinity is a hollowed-out version of the hero he once was. He is a silent titan, his mind suppressed by the golden light of the god riding on his back. The battle at the gate of divinity is the collision of two different versions of strength. The tarnished represents the chaotic free will of the discarded, while Radahn represents the rigid, beautiful order of Miquella's dream. Miquella clings to Radahn's shoulders, his many arms wrapping around the general in a hug that is actually a spiritual shackle. This union was intended to be the final answer to Marika's fractured world. A lord and a god who could never be divided. Because the union was built on a foundation of kidnapping and brainwashing, it was a union that lacked any true honor. Radahn was a warrior of the stars who had been turned into a meat puppet for a child's ambition. Miquella's desire for the strongest consort showed his lack of faith in his own kindness. He knew that a world of compassion required a sword to maintain the peace, and he was willing to desecrate his brother's memory to obtain it. Part 21. Messmer. Miquella's journey through the Shadow Realm required him to bypass his shadow brother, Messmer the Impaler. Messmer was the guardian of the Land of Shadow, and the primary obstacle to the Gate of Divinity. But for Miquella, he was also a living reminder of the Golden Order's original sin. Messmer was a man who had burned an entire civilization for the love of his mother, Marika, a love that had eventually seen him abandoned and erased from history. Miquella viewed Messmer as a relic of the old way of ruling through fire and fear. Miquella's treatment of Messmer was one of cold indifference. He did not seek to save his brother or to heal the serpentine curse that plagued him. Instead, he simply used the chaos of the Tarnished's arrival to ensure Messmer's downfall. He saw Messmer as a casualty of the transition, a man whose trauma and fire had no place in a world of soft gold and compelled affection. Miquella's kindness did not extend to those who represented the violence of the past. The contrast between the two brothers is stark. Messmer was a man who knew he was a monster and stayed in the dark out of a sense of duty. Miquella was a boy who believed he was a savior and sought the light to impose his will on everyone. Messmer's fire was honest in its destruction, while Miquella's charm was deceptive in its peace. By ignoring Messmer's suffering, Miquella proved that his new age would be just as exclusionary as his mother's. Messmer's flame was the only thing capable of burning the sealing tree that blocked the path to Anir Elim, and Miquella knew this. He allowed the Tarnished to do the bloody work of defeating Messmer, using his own sibling as a sacrificial key to the gate. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, letting the Lord of Shadow burn his last strength so that the God of Light could ascend. Miquella did not offer a single word of comfort to the brother who had guarded his secrets for eons. Messmer's death was the final stepping stone for Miquella. He watched as the Shadow Realm's protector fell, his only concern being the clearance of the path. This indifference showed that Miquella had already lost his soul long before he reached the final crosses. He was a god who used the suffering of his family as the foundation for his paradise, a trait that made him the true successor to Marika's ruthlessness. Section 6, The Tragedy, Part 22, The Kindness. Question. The central conflict of Miquella's character is the kindness question. Whether his age of compassion was an act of genuine love or the ultimate form of divine tyranny. Miquella's goal was to end all conflict, all war, and all hatred by making everyone in the world love him. In his eyes, this was the highest possible form of mercy. If no one has the capacity to be unkind, then suffering ceases to exist. But this peace was built on the total removal of free will. It was a kind world because no one was allowed the agency to be anything else. His age of compassion was a state of total magical mind control. The hugs he offers in his boss fight are mechanical attempts to steal the player's heart. A literal game over that occurs when the Tarnished's will is finally broken by his radiance. This power shows that Miquella's kindness was a weapon. He viewed the human heart as a broken machine that needed to be rewired to stay in a state of permanent, blissful obedience. He was a god of the end of history, seeking to create a world where nothing could ever happen, because no one could ever want anything. This raises the question of whether Miquella himself was even good by the time he reached the gate. Having discarded his love, his heart, and his humanity at the crosses, he was a being of pure, indifferent order. He pursued kindness because it was his original programming, not because he actually felt empathy for the suffering. He was a child god playing with a world-sized dollhouse, arranging the figures into peaceful poses because he couldn't stand the sight of them fighting. The kindness of Miquella was essentially a spiritual lobotomy. By removing the ability to hate, he also removed the ability to truly love, as love requires a choice. His world would have been one of beautiful, empty shells, smiling at a god they were magically incapable of rejecting. It was the ultimate, perfect order that Radahn had dreamed of, stripped of the messy biological reality of the Crucible. Miquella was the fundamentalist's dream taken to its most horrific, logical conclusion. The tragedy of the question is that Miquella truly believed he was the savior. He did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as the only person brave enough to do what was necessary. He believed that the cost of free will was too high for a world that had suffered so much. By making the choice for everyone, he believed he was carrying the world's burden, unaware that by taking away the struggle, he was taking away the soul. His kindness was a parasite of light that fed on the agency of the world. Part 23, The Pattern of Failure. Miquella's entire existence is defined by a consistent, heartbreaking pattern of failure. Despite his status as a genius and a prodigy, every single project he undertook withered before it could bloom. The Haligtree became a rot-infested husk. The golden needle was a temporary fix. The ritual at Castle Sol failed to grant Godwyn death, and his unalloyed gold was ultimately powerless against the rot. Miquella was the eternal infant who was always looking for the next, more divine solution, instead of facing the consequences of his current failures. This pattern suggests a fundamental flaw in Miquella's character. He could not accept any form of imperfection. When a project began to decay or show its limits, he abandoned it in favor of a more pure vision. He left his sister, his followers, and his tree to rot while he chased a phantom godhood in the shadow realm. He was a perfectionist in a world of entropy, a child who would throw away a toy the moment it broke. This inability to stick with the mess of humanity is what led him to discard his own heart. The Haligtree is the most visible evidence of this trait. It was a beautiful dream of sanctuary, but the moment Miquella realized it wouldn't grant him godhood, he allowed himself to be taken by Mohg. He used the kidnapping as an excuse to restart his journey elsewhere, leaving the Albinaurics to pay the price. Miquella was a god of potential, always promising a better future, but always leaving a trail of wreckage in the present. He was the most powerful Empyrean, yet he could never see a single plan through to a healthy conclusion. His final failure at the gate of divinity was the logical end of this pattern. He had discarded so much of himself to succeed that by the time he became a god, there was nothing left of the person who had started the journey. He achieved the transformation, but he did so by becoming a being that the world had to destroy. His pattern of failure was a result of his refusal to engage with the world as it was. He wanted to rewrite reality rather than live in it, and in the end, reality fought back. He was a master of the beginning, but a stranger to the middle. He lacked the endurance to see his projects through the rot and the dark. He preferred to start again with a clean slate, a habit that left the lands between littered with his abandoned miracles. Each failure pushed him further toward the divine, as he believed that only total godhood could provide the perfection he craved. He died as he lived, a golden promise that withered the moment it was touched by the hand of a tarnished. Part 24. The Gate of Divinity. At the top of the Tower of Enirilim, Miquella finally steps through the Gate of Divinity, the same threshold where Marika once pulled the gold from the blood. He emerges as a god, his form radiant and ethereal, riding upon the back of the resurrected Radahn. He is beautiful, serene, and utterly terrifying, a being who has transcended the physical world to become a living son of compassion. In this moment, Miquella believes he has finally succeeded. He offers the tarnished a hug, a final divine embrace that is actually a spiritual lobotomy intended to end the conflict forever. The Gate of Divinity is a place of absolute cost. To pass through it, Miquella had to step over the corpses of his brothers and the wreckage of his own soul. The god who emerges is not a person, but a radiant frequency. He no longer speaks as a man, but as an oracle of a new age. His age of compassion is ready to begin, but it is an age that is born in a graveyard. The beauty of his ascension is a mask for the horror of what he has become. He is a deity of pure compulsion, a being whose very presence demands surrender. The fight against Miquella and Radahn is the final confrontation between the order of the past and the freedom of the future. Miquella clings to Radahn's shoulders, his multiple arms wrapping around the Lord in a gesture that functions like a harness. He uses the Star Scourge as a physical shield while he rains down pillars of golden light on the tarnished. He is a god who refuses to fight his own battles, relying on the charm of his consort to do the work. The Gate of Divinity has granted him everything he wanted, but it has left him a parasite on the strength of others. The kindness he offers at the gate is the final test of the tarnished's will. If the player is caught in his embrace twice, their heart is stolen, and they fall to their knees in a state of permanent, blissful adoration. This is Miquella's victory, a world where there are no more enemies, only lovers who have no choice. He has turned the ultimate battlefield into a temple of compelled affection. But because the tarnished is the one who carries the fracture of the world, and they are the only ones capable of seeing through the light, the gate itself is built of the bodies of the Hornsent and the shaman, a monument to the cycle of violence that Miquella claimed to hate. By using it, he was implicitly accepting the foundation of his mother's bloody order. He was not creating something new. He was just occupying the same bloody throne with a different colored crown. The radiance he projects from the gate is so blinding that it obscures the piles of corpses beneath his feet. He became a god of light in a city of death, a contradiction that the world could no longer sustain. Part 25. What defeat means. By defeating Miquella at the gate of divinity, the Tarnished ensures that the world remains fractured but fundamentally free. The death of the child god is a mercy for the lands between, preventing the onset of a global state of magical mind control. But for those who followed him, defeat means a total and agonizing collapse. The high of Miquella's charm is gone, leaving the Albinorics and the warriors of the Shadow Realm to face the cold, harsh reality of their own suffering. Miquella was the drug that kept the world from feeling its own wounds. The death of Miquella leaves his followers with nothing but the memory of a lie. Leda and her companions die in a heap of infighting, their loyalty having turned into a bitter resentment. The Haligtree continues to rot, its last hope for a savior having been extinguished at the gate. The people nobody wanted are once again alone in a world that doesn't want them. Miquella's kindness had given them a temporary reprieve, but his defeat reveals that he had no long-term plan for their survival. However, the defeat of Miquella is also the only way for the world to ever truly heal. As long as he existed, the possibility of a true ending was impossible, as he would have simply charmed the world into a state of permanent suspension. By removing the kind tyrant, the Tarnished allows the natural cycles of conflict and change to return. The world is messy, violent, and broken, but it is at least a world where people can choose their own path. Miquella's defeat is the preservation of the human soul. In his final moments, Miquella is a figure of profound pathos. He dies as a god who tried to save everyone and ended up being killed by the very person who was supposed to help him. He is a tragedy of overambition and under-empathy. He proved that you cannot force a better world into existence. As his light fades from the gate of divinity, the land of shadow returns to its silent, grey stagnation. The age of compassion dies in the womb, leaving the Tarnished to stand alone over the corpse of a hero. The defeat also marks the end of the Divine Twins' legacy. With Miquella dead, Malenia's long wait at the Haligtree is finally revealed as a journey to nowhere. The entire history of their symbiotic struggle was for a goal that was ultimately rejected by the world. Miquella's death is the final period on the sentence of Marika's lineage. The gods have all failed, and the world is left to the mortals and the Tarnished to decide what comes next. The light of the child god is gone, and the long, cold night of reality has finally arrived. Part 26. Miquella's tragedy. Miquella the Kind is the god of unrequited compassion, a being who spent his entire life trying to cure everyone except himself. He was the most powerful of the Empyreans, yet he remained a child who was unable to cope with the reality of loss. His tragedy is that in his pursuit of a perfect world, he lost the very things, his love, his sister, and his self, that made him want to save the world in the first place. He became a god of the morning by murdering the saint of the night, leaving behind a legacy of withered trees and broken hearts. He died a god, but he lost his soul long before the Tarnished arrived at the gate. By the time he ascended, he was a being of pure golden indifference, a radiant frequency that had forgotten the taste of soup or the warmth of a shared fire. He had fixed his failures by erasing his capacity to feel them. He was a survivor of the Golden Order, who became its most absolute version, a child god who wanted to turn the universe into a safe room. He was the eternal infant who refused to let the world grow up, and in the end, the world had to kill him. The ultimate irony of Miquella's life is that his kindness was his most destructive trait. It was the charm that led Mohg to madness, the promise that led Malenia to rot, and the light that led his followers to their deaths. He was a well-meaning monster, a being whose love was so heavy it crushed everything it touched. He is the most tragic character because he was the only one who actually tried to be good, and he proved that good without humanity is just another form of evil. He was a boy who became a god who should have remained a boy. As the ash settles on the gate of divinity, the memory of Miquella remains as a warning. He is the evidence that the pursuit of purity always leads to the grave. He left the world exactly as he found it, fractured, stagnant, and waiting for an ending. He was a brilliant, golden flash in the dark that promised everything and delivered a beautiful, hollow silence. Miquella the Kind is finally at rest, his curse finally ended by the cold steel of the Tarnished, leaving the world to find its own way through the night. The final tragedy of Miquella is that he will be remembered as a villain by the history he tried so hard to save. The people of the future will not know of his love for Malenia or his care for the Albinaurics. They will only know the charm and the kidnapping and the gate of corpses. He sacrificed his reputation along with his soul, dying as a radiant anomaly that the world had to purge. He was the most powerful Empyrean who lost everything he was trying to protect, including his own name. Even in death, his influence lingers in the form of the Saint Trina's sleep and the wilting branches of the Haligtree. He is a ghost of a better world that was never allowed to exist. The tragedy of Miquella is the tragedy of perfection. It is a goal that can only be achieved by destroying the very life it is meant to serve. He remains a golden shadow in the history of the lands between, the boy who would have been a god, and the god who was never truly a man.